the importance of a lot of different voices and hearing a lot of different voices. And, I've always gone back to that Edmund Burke line of, your representative owes you their considered conscience. It's not necessarily a majority will vote, but it's that considered conscience.
Hello and welcome to the Culture Things podcast. I'm your host, Brendan Rogers, and this is episode 72. And today I'm talking with the Honourable Scott Farlow. Scott Farlow MLC was elected to the New South Wales Legislative Council in 2015. He currently serves as a government whip in the Legislative Council. Scott served as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer and for COVID recovery from July 2020 to December 2021, a role which encompassed varied and detailed projects including supporting the New South Wales Federal Financial Relations Review, engaging with industry and businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic, and supporting the delivery and implementation of COVID-19 related programs and stimulus. Since entering Parliament, Scott has served as Leader of the House in the Legislative Council and Parliamentary Secretary to the Premier, served as Chair of the Standing Committee on Social Issues, Law and Justice, Regulation and the Select Committee on Legislative Council Committee System, and served as a member on many other committees. Prior to entering Parliament, Scott served as both Mayor and as Councillor on Strathfield Council and has previously worked as an analyst and strategic advisor for large firms, state and federal parliamentarians. Today, we're focused on Scott's role in the COVID-19 response in New South Wales. Scott, welcome to the Culture Things podcast.
Thanks, Brendan. It's great to be here with you and all of your listeners.
Mate, pleasure having you. Pleasure to catch up again. Thank you very much for giving us some time today. Mate, I need to ask before we dive into some of this stuff around COVID, that dreaded C word. I saw something on your social media. Know yourself. I've met Penny, your lovely wife, a few times. Your idea of romance, this scrutineering, what is, you're making me look like a tragic romantic and I'm far from it. What's going on there?
Well, look, you've got to get the opportunities where you can. Penny and I both have fairly busy careers, and so you take the opportunities where they present themselves. And if that might be a night of romantic scrutineering, well, so be it. But it's always a little bit difficult when you go out for a date and there's 20 people from the Electoral Commission who are assembled around you as well. It just sort of does kill the mood a little bit. I'm
sure it does, mate. Any false move, they snap it on camera and put it on their own social media as well. No, good, mate. Like you said, you've got to take the opportunity where you can. So well done. I'm sure you guys have unbelievable conversations around your dinner table at times around sort of politics and what's going on and the different challenges you have.
Well, look, at times, and, sometimes my wife also chides me and tells me that, you can't treat every discussion like it's question time. So, especially when we get into arguments, and she says to me, I'm not the opposition, okay? So don't treat me that way.
Well, look,
but I can assure you she gives as good as she gets.
I'm sure she does, mate. I'm sure she does. Let's put you in this hot seat of question time, hey? Let's start grilling you. You've given us some valuable time. So let's get into this topic around COVID-19 and your involvement in the response of COVID-19 for New South Wales and the state government. Mate, so cast back to, I guess, the early days, March 2020 when it kicked off in Australia. Your official role involved in the COVID-19 response started in June, July 2020. Yep. But what were some of those early days like for you, if you can cast your mind back?
Yeah, well, look, I think with the emergence of COVID, like all of us, it was an unknown and we didn't really know where it was going to go. And I've got to say, I went to London in sort of the back end of February, maybe to the beginning of March in 2020. And so I was worried at that time leaving Australia about transiting through Singapore because Singapore had about 100 cases at that time in total. I think New South Wales, Australia had about 12, and I was going to the UK that was in single digits. And so my concern was a transit through Singapore, so I changed the flights to go through the UAE instead. And it was amazing how quickly things started to develop during that period. So by the time I'd finished in London, I think it was the last day I was in London, where I got the first newspaper article about what was happening in Italy at the time and watching that. And I flew back to Australia and was watching then what was starting to unfold. And pretty much if I had have been back here, I think a week or so later, we would have instituted hotel quarantine by that, or home quarantine at least by that stage, I think. So things started to happen very, very quickly during the beginning of that pandemic. And I came back to a period pretty similar to now in the New South Wales Parliament, where we were looking at budget estimates. And so we're sitting in estimate committees many of those days and watching some of the stories and the case trajectories that were occurring, and really starting to wonder how big this was going to be and how big an impact it was going to be on Australia. And I think that our federal government took some really bold and strong decisions at that time as well, and in terms of the border closures. And I still cast my mind back to actually before I went to London, myself and Minister Tudorhope, who at the time was the Minister for Small Business. We were doing visits through business communities, particularly with a high Chinese population, so in Burwood and Eastwood, and talking to those local shopkeepers about the impact it was having without international students. And also the behaviour that we were seeing, where people were fearful because of what was largely social media stories that were going around that didn't have any truth to them, but, that somebody in a restaurant had COVID and watch out going to this place. And we were going through, I was the Mayor of Strathfield, Burwood was my neighbouring suburb. I'd lived there for 25 years. I knew the place like the back of my hand, and I'd never seen it so quiet in going there. And our main concern at that point, sort of in mid-February, was about what we could do to support businesses in Burwood and Eastwood, Chinatown in the city, because that was where we were seeing the big impact, where we were talking to shopkeepers and they were saying our turnover's down 75, 80%. And we were looking at a package like that and worried about international students, how we open the borders back up, how we got people back in, how we got confidence, and then to see the wave that occurred. And I've got to say, I think back to that a lot in terms of that very early days response as to maybe how naive we were at the time as to what the impact would be. And where we're hearing stories about only one person from the family coming out to do the shopping and then hurriedly going back home in those communities, having seen what was happening in China, I think all of Australia found ourselves doing exactly the same thing in a matter of weeks.
I know you're obviously part of a much bigger fish and the conversation you would have had with the Treasurer and the Premier at the time and stuff, but from a personal point of view, how difficult is it for you to make decisions or push certain things a certain way based on probably at that time limited information and a lot of sort of scared sort of not knowing what this could bring and what will happen? How tough is that in a position like yours? Well,
look, I think that it's the unknown, really, and everybody was going through the unknown at the same time, and this was a global phenomenon that was occurring, and we were all watching overseas at the time to try to see some jurisdictions that had significant challenges with COVID already and how they were dealing with it. Of course, there was the Chinese response, which I think Australians broadly thought could never happen here, and some of the stories that were coming out of China. I was looking a lot at what was happening in South Korea. South Korea at that early stage had a huge spike, and South Korea was sort of able to get on top of it relatively quickly and change their trajectory when it came to their management. And they did that on very localised restrictions. And South Korea actually did publish a bit of a playbook on that too, which I found quite useful to go through and to have a look at how they actually approached it. So even at that early stage, there was not a lot of information, but there were some things to pick up on that we could draw on from our experience. And I think, the federal government did that in terms of the border closures, following very closely with the United States and what they'd done with China. And then, of course, the federal government then extending that to South Korea and Iran at the time, I think it was, were the next two countries. And then, of course, that went to a global border ban that we saw in place that did make sure that we had a protective wall effectively up around Australia for a long period that served us fairly well through those early stages of the pandemic and allowed us as state governments to be able to get on top of the issues. And to that point, effectively, where I was brought into the role of COVID recovery, where we'd actually been able to sort of quell cases in New South Wales and be in a position where we were really managing COVID and working our way down towards COVID zero.
I've got to ask you, mate, what were your initial thoughts when, I guess, you were approached, by the Premier, I'm assuming, around, heading up this sort of COVID response for New South Wales? Like, can you think of your initial response like, holy shit, this is a big job?
Well, In a sense, I'd been doing some of the work already. As the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, one of my first things where I was called in was effectively looking after our stimulus programs and making sure that I could work with the Treasury officials to be able to ensure we were doing something that Treasury is not really focused in a mind to of getting money out the door. Treasury is often seen within government as the department that says no, effectively the cautionary conservative department that is where people are a little bit more cautionary when it comes to expenditure. That's always the view of Treasury. And we got into a position where the role of Treasury became following up departments and saying, have you spent your money? We need this response. Business needs this response. The community needs this response. And that came around some of our initial programs that were about community safety as well. So, for instance, our COVID cleaning program that we had there, the government, I think it was $300 million, had made a contribution to ensuring that we improved our cleaning and hygiene systems on public transport, schools, government office buildings, and that was all removed from health. And health had its own bucket of money to be able to, I think it was $7 billion at the time, to be able to improve the hospital system. But just broadly across the scheme, where we were working to get more people employed in these roles, more people diverted from other roles to be able to manage some of these programs and make sure that they were actually delivered on the ground. So that was sort of my role in the beginning stage of the pandemic before taking on the title of Parliamentary Secretary for COVID Recovery. And then the Premier asked me in July, I still remember the meeting we had about it was actually the day Victoria went into lockdown, or Melbourne went into lockdown as sort of the cases started to escalate in Victoria. And the Premier at the time, Gladys Berejiklian and myself, were sitting there watching Dan Andrews' press conference as I was taking on this role. And it showed really, I think at that point for both of us, what we wanted to do that was different in New South Wales. But we needed to always be mindful that it only takes one case for this to sort of get out of hand. And while we very much had at that point our mind set on recovery and how we could get businesses back after a couple of months of restrictions and lockdowns, and at that point we thought, in a sense, that they were the harshest restrictions we could have. And of course, we saw later on that we went further in terms of restrictions in place with the Delta wave. But we were very mindful about how we could coexist with the virus to the point that we are now, effectively, where we could manage it, try to keep people in jobs. It was always the two challenges that we faced, the challenge of lives and livelihoods, and being able to get a good score on both.
Yeah, it's a great point. I just want to go back. So what you're telling me is that meeting, it wasn't a case of you were late to the meeting or you didn't turn up to a meeting, you should have been there, so you got an action because you weren't there?
No.
Hey, how about we throw this basket to Scott?
No, look, I think it was somewhat of an acknowledgement of the role I'd played on the Treasury side with our stimulus programs and the like, and being able to work with our Treasury officials who worked incredibly hard, and all government did, and still does, in trying to make sure these responses were hitting the mark. And whether they were the business support programs that were in place, whether they were things like that COVID cleaning package, or whether it was things like, for instance, our homelessness support services to get people who were rough sleepers, completely vulnerable to COVID out there in the community into safe accommodation for that period when we really didn't know. And we were looking around the world, and it's no exaggeration to say we were seeing, bodies piling up in New York. We were seeing hospitals overcome in Italy. So to see what the rest of the world was going through, and the position we were in Australia, and to try to be able to make sure that we weren't going down that same path, was a huge challenge. And to know that, really that fate could be ours very, very quickly.
I mentioned the sort of limited information and then sort of information flowing through over time and the benefit of time, I suppose. But was there a decision you'd been involved in on behalf of the government where, in hindsight, it's actually turned out to be you had limited information at the time, but decisions need to be made, and it's turned out really well, a good decision? Is there one that sticks in your mind?
It's a good question. I think that when we look at, there was probably a time when we held our nerve and there was a time we didn't. One was when it came to the Northern Beaches outbreak, when as a government we had, of course, a lockdown that was instituted in a very defined geographic area in the Northern Beaches. it was a pretty harsh decision. It, of course, came at Christmas and the New Year period. And everyone was telling us at the time, like you heard it in the media, that we needed to go further. All of Sydney, all of New South Wales needed to be put in a lockdown. The usual suspects were out there saying it couldn't be managed. And it turned out that we could. Now, the Northern Beaches is a very particular geographic region. And anyone who knows it, and I lived there for a period of my life, there's effectively 3 ways in. So it is relatively easy to isolate compared to other parts of Sydney or New South Wales. And it's known as the Insular Peninsula. And people in the Northern Beaches were relatively content with being somewhat isolated for that period within the Northern Beaches. And of course, that then got to a gradation between the restrictions in place in the northern part and the southern part of the Northern Beaches. That was something where everyone was saying, no, you can't do it. This is going to end in tears. This is reckless. It was somewhere where we held our nerve and it turned out to be right. And that's the good example of that. I think when it came to then the Delta wave, some of us, myself particularly included, and not to say that I was around the decision-making table on this, but my view certainly was that with the Delta wave, that maybe a similar approach to the Northern Beaches would have seen it end in the same result, and it didn't. I think that perhaps if we look, I think at the end of the day, it wouldn't have changed anything. And we saw with Victoria took a very strong response when it came to that Delta wave, and they ended up in the same trajectory as New South Wales, only slightly delayed. So I don't think anything would have materially changed, but it is certainly somewhere where it shows you how quickly things can change, and the fact scenarios in front of you really can present very different outcomes. And we've seen that again with another variant with Omicron, and who knows what variant is to come next and how our response has to change. But the lesson certainly for me from the Delta wave was that we need to be sure that we're very flexible with our response, and we need to look at what we're really confronted with and how it is different to anything else that's come before it.
Yeah, mate. In a lot of the work I do, I talk with leaders and teams a lot around it's about having clarity over certainty, because certainty is the thing that sort of the analysis paralysis, sometimes it really stops us. Using that analogy, clarity over certainty, how important was it in some of these decisions and some very, very tough decisions that as a government there was clarity rather than waiting on certainty?
100%. So I think that my role in going back and forth, like my role fundamentally in this was not sitting around the decision-making table saying this is what's going to happen, but dealing with what happened from the decision-making table. And literally these things would come on very, very quickly. So restrictions would be put in place, changed operating models across the state, public health orders, and they would be announced at the 11 a.m. press conference. Sometimes they come out later in the day in a press conference, in a press release. Even one that came out, I remember, at like 10 o'clock at night, effectively through a public health order and that response. But then dealing with business and other organisations as to how they implemented those changes. And constantly, business would say to us that we just need clarity around what we have to do. We need clarity about how we have to operate and what you expect of us. At the beginning, a lot were saying, we just want certainty. We just want certainty, we want to know. And look, they'd look at different models. They'd look at the Victorian model, or they'd look at the New Zealand model, where there was sort of this gradation of here's phase 3, here's what level 4 restrictions look like. And a lot of them would say, we just want that. We want that sort of certainty. But then you'd go back and say, well, look, if we went into level 4, for instance, you might be restricted from trading all that. And most businesses would then say, okay, we don't want that, but we just want the clarity. We want to be able to understand how we operate. And through a difficult time where I think everybody learnt very quickly that there just is no certainty through a 1 in 100 year pandemic. Things are going to twist and change. We saw that through the Delta wave. We've seen that through the Omicron wave, and whatever may come next, that there does need to be a flexibility in response, but we need to make sure that even if we're wrong on some of these points, that at least it's clear. At least it's clear of what we expect of people and what we're doing ourselves. That's got to be clear. And I think that fundamentally it's taught me that clarity is much more important than certainty.
It's a great learning, isn't it? I want to talk, you mentioned business, and obviously businesses across the board, not only in New South Wales, Australia-wise and globally, have had some pretty dire impacts, although also some businesses actually thrived, and that dreaded word pivot has come in a lot, but they've taken on different opportunities, or the space they're in has been really a great opportunity for them. I want to target, though, the construction industry, because that must have been a very, very tough process around. It's such a massive part of the economy. Can you just give us, and again, I understand confidentiality and stuff, but I'd like to understand a little bit more about some of the decision around making that call to shut down construction for, I think it was a couple of weeks from memory.
Yeah. Well, look, it got walked back in a little bit, but you're right. And in terms of construction and the construction industry, I think I'm on the record in saying it was one of those decisions that I wasn't necessarily supportive of, and I wasn't around the table when that was made. But I remember being on the call with businesses when it was being announced probably about 15 minutes before the press conference at 11 a.m. and sort of the tailspin that people went into at that point. From my understanding, and as I said, I wasn't sitting around the table on this decision, but from what my understanding was that although there wasn't necessarily a great correlation of COVID cases and those seeding through the construction industry, there was a great correlation when it came to those who were COVID positive and their place of work being in construction. And so that decision was sort of taken in that regard. Now, funnily enough, to go through some of the conversations we'd had with business before, with Victoria, one of the challenges that I'd often hear in terms of how Victoria was operating back in 2020 was in terms of the pared down construction sector and how it just would not work. I think they were operating at 25% capacity at that stage. And amazingly, how many people from the construction sector came to us and said, look, we just want to operate on what happened in Victoria. Give us 25%. Even though that was the biggest criticism I'd heard out of Victoria the year before. And people saying we'd prefer to be just shut down rather than operating under those environments. But what happened fairly quickly was, and I think when I say fairly quickly, I think happened on that call even 15 minutes before it was publicly announced, was that we started to get that construction task force together, which Minister Ayres chaired, and they worked through, and I think Deputy Premier Barilaro as well, and they worked through how they could get construction up and running again as such a major part of the economy. And the construction sector was certainly looking at everything they could possibly do to be able to make that work, and implementing rapid antigen tests before they were even really approved, and they needed a medical professional to administer them, and having some sort of testing regime on site with some of the larger players. So the industry did so much themselves to be able to make it as safe a working environment as possible. But it was a very difficult decision that was made. It was one that I think caused quite a lot of grief. But as people from other industry sectors said to me as well, whether it be hospitality or the entertainment industry, it was similar to what they went through. Construction had effectively gone through a period of a year where they were largely in New South Wales not impacted by the COVID restrictions that were in place. And then in a very short space of time with very little warning, which is how most of these decisions occurred, ended up in a very similar position to all those other sectors. And it caused a lot of grief, but I think we were trying to navigate through how we could keep as much open as possible throughout all of that period, and how we could save as many lives as possible as well. And you've got to remember at that stage, we had a very small vaccinated population in New South Wales, and we were trying to contain it geographically as much as possible so that the regions could stay open, even that some areas of Sydney could stay open. And it's amazing some of the decisions that were made at the time, some right, some wrong, some that worked, some that didn't, but there's no playbook to this stuff.
No, unfortunately not, even, I guess, with learnings and reviews that may happen about what worked, what didn't work, but whatever happens next, again, it's not going to be a plug and play approach, is it? Unfortunately, it's never like that. Let's just again, on that business side, but I'd like to just move that into, I guess you alluded to the sort of city and regional areas. And again, I certainly don't have my dates in line, but there were times when, New South Wales was sort of closed as well, certainly not as harshly as Victoria, but there seemed to be a blanket approach taken around, city and maybe some of the risks from an outsider's point of view versus regional. Can you talk to that a little bit? Give us a bit of an understanding about why that was the case.
Well, look, I think originally the view was that all of New South Wales moved together. That was the original view that was held, city, country, and that was quite strong from our regional MPs as well. That they wanted to see the same settings statewide in the early days of the response. So there were and I think that there was a lot of fear in regional communities as well about COVID. And I know from even family that I have in the regions that there was just a strong level of fear about anyone from the city coming to the regions and bringing COVID with them. And of course, the regions, when it comes to the hospital facilities, it's not as strong as what it is in the metropolitan areas, and that is a certain vulnerability for regional communities that I know a lot of them were concerned about what would happen to their health system if they had a COVID wave, particularly in those early days. So that was the initial sort of approach, and as we came out of it, I think that there was a view that we could relax in the regions quicker than we could in the city because the risk just wasn't there. The northern beaches, I think, was where we really started to change the view in terms of how we could differentiate between city and country, so to speak, and those regional areas, and how we could try to contain this as much as possible so that we didn't have as significant an impact. And if we could allow the regions to continue on, then we would. And so that was very much the approach that came when it was the Delta wave, where we got very defined in regional settings. Like the first restrictions came in a couple of, I think it was 4 local government areas. It was the eastern suburbs, it was the inner west and City of Sydney, I think, and might have been a few more than that. Canada Bay, I think, was in there as well. Were the first couple of restrictions. Then that only lasted a day. We then moved to all of Greater Sydney being in a lockdown after that. And of course, because of the connectivity between regions as well, areas like the Central Coast, the Blue Mountains, the Illawarra were involved in that as well, because we were seeing communities move amongst each other. And then we got to a position, I think, where it just became clearly evident that despite our best efforts of containing it in certain areas, that there was an impact across New South Wales and that we needed to take a New South Wales approach. And when you talk about those border closures, I know that New South Wales, funnily enough, I remember a lot of my colleagues actually calling for closures to the borders very early on about, Queensland and Victoria. And I remember the Premier saying quite clearly at the time, it's like, I don't know why we're closed to them, because the threat comes from us in the very early stages. Like, if anything, it's like they can close them to us, which they did. And of course, New South Wales, when the threat was there on the Victorian border, did close the Victorian border for a period of time. And that was very difficult because our border communities are so interconnected. Like, the Tweed sees themselves very much as part of the Gold Coast and vice versa. Albury-Wodonga are interchangeable effectively in terms of an identity. It's a city across a river. And there's a health service that they share effectively down there. So they're such connected communities that the devastation for those communities is significant when those borders are closed. And I worked a lot through the freight industries as well, and working with them in their challenges through this. And the border closures for those freight industries meant that at times they were taking cabs down and changing over the trailers effectively, because it was just the easiest way to do it. And the freight task across Australia was severely impacted. So all of those challenges were in place, and we wanted to do as much as possible to limit the restrictions in place across New South Wales. But at times it got to the point that we all just had to come in as one, as we were sort of declaring, like I remember the press conferences where we were declaring sort of a third of the state to be local government areas of concern, so to speak, and then put under different restrictions. And there just seemed to be not much of the state left, that we got to sort of statewide restrictions again, and they all sort of peeled back but they all were taken with the approach of having as limited impact as possible on the community, while being able to still achieve what we needed to as part of the health outcome.
Mate, I imagine, and the realistic approach is there's so many challenges there, and with your own personal challenges, personal values, let me say, as a leader, is what was the biggest challenge for you in that, where you may have found your personal values compromised in, some of the decisions you're either involved in, or actually indeed some of the decisions you're involved in implementing, given your role in the response?
It certainly made me reassess some of my political views in this period. So I'm a small government Liberal, Conservative, and I've always taken the view that government should not really intervene in the market, and there should be as limited restrictions as possible. So this has really challenged me a lot when it comes to my ideology in terms of the response needed. And interestingly, I still remember before we had a lockdown in Australia, I had a libertarian friend reach out to me from the US saying we needed to effectively, he's like, couldn't understand why Australia hadn't implemented lockdowns. And I remember writing back to him and saying effectively all the reasons why I believed we could get through it without actually implementing a lockdown like we were seeing in other countries. Funnily enough, I think for the first wave, that probably did hold true somewhat, and we did achieve that with what was a lockdown, but perhaps what some would deem as a lockdown light, where retail largely stayed open, people could still go out for essential purposes. The definition of essential was pretty broad. There, of course, were industries that were closed down that were seen as high risk, but life probably wasn't as restrictive here as what it was in other places. And I saw that we could do that because of our borders and the fact that they were closed. And I think that was largely true. Hotel quarantine, which not every country in the world implemented that sort of system. And also the high rates of testing that we had in the early stages comparative to the rest of the world, and high quality PCR testing that was very accurate. And I think that did actually help us through that stage. But I was amazed that this friend of mine who was, a very strong libertarian, had that view. And I guess that events do make you perhaps look at it in a more pragmatic way at how government needs to respond and what a public health response needs to be, where there does need to be a population-wide approach, because individualism certainly won't get you there necessarily when it comes to a pandemic and a virus like this. And so it does require a different response. And I'm quite a student of history and have been listening to Neil Ferguson's Doom recently on an audiobook as I run, and just looking at how that response has largely been there through every sort of pandemic that we've seen, and how there is a certain need for a more communal approach when it comes to some of these challenges, which are different to other political challenges that I've seen. So it certainly has taught me a level of pragmatism to the challenge in front of you.
Scott, certainly many, again, challenges and personal values being challenged. From a media perspective, and particularly your role, how did the media help or hinder in some of the communication that you needed to get across for government and some of these decisions you're making?
Well, look, the media was essential, and the fact that people did tune into the 11 a.m. press conference. And I've got to say, we had many discussions where, with bureaucrats and the like, in Treasury or in health or in other areas, or in business, for instance, telling us, like, can you get this message out on the 11 a.m. press conference? Because people were watching it, and it was across every channel effectively. And we'd go from one state premier to the next through this response, and people plugging away, whether it be, for instance, I can remember having a conversation with the Shoppers Union about abuse for people in supermarkets and getting that message across when people are being requested to check in, for instance, and how people shouldn't be abusing shop assistants and shopkeepers in that regard, and sort of plugging away to try to get those into the messages, whether it was through the police that was standing up, whether it was through the Premier or whichever minister might be addressing that press conference that day as well. So there were really key messages that I think the media, in an unfiltered way, which is a little different to what people are used to in consuming media, particularly this day and age, that it was a very unfiltered way to get out communication, those 11 a.m. press conferences, because they were covered in full. People were watching for the first time a press conference for an hour and seeing all of the questions that were asked. But there's a certain danger to that as well, that there is a very direct message that you want to get out there, and it's essential for you to get out there. Like, if there was a certain change to the public health order that was coming in place, we needed people to know about it. But it might be a bizarre question 45 minutes into that press conference that somebody would tune into and take that message away, or a question that wasn't answered necessarily in the direct way you'd want, but that was all somebody tuned into, and so they took that message. And I've got to say, there were many times throughout the period that I was in the Parliamentary Secretary role where I would get calls from people or businesses that would respond to something that was at 45 minutes in the press conference and was all they'd seen. And I won't say that anyone misspoke, but it might have been taken out of that context from that little grab. So it was very different to the way people usually consume media or have typically consumed media. So that's certainly been a challenge. I think also people's focus, the concentration on the numbers, so to speak, and the obsession with the numbers. I think now we're getting to a position where people are not as obsessed about the numbers that are there. And of course, we don't need to be as obsessed because we're in a different stage of the pandemic. We have a variant that is less deadly, maybe a lot more transmissible, but less deadly. We have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, and we've got additional treatments and we've got hospital capacity that's there. So the threat is different, and we need to change our response in accordance with that threat level. But I still think that there was that obsession with the case numbers that made people perhaps a little more scared than they necessarily needed to be during that period. And I think that the media could fan the flames on that as well. And to think that, now I don't even know how many cases we have today, but I know we had 16,000 odd yesterday. Saying figures like that a year ago, people would be barricading their doors.
Yeah, it's a great point. I don't know what the figures are too, and for so long we were reliant and hanging on these numbers. So, and it takes me, I guess, to the next flow of the conversation, just around the wash up and where we've opened up again and masks are no longer necessary in most settings. There's still some where they are, but what's the challenge been, the end of sort of 2021 where you're winding up the role and the responsibility, but starting to open things up again? What was the biggest challenge you found, and even through that communication with media and the mindset that people have had? Because like you referred to, big government, we want, again, small government ideally, but there's always been this reliance in the community that, government's making decisions for me and telling me certain things to do, and they didn't like that to start with. But all of a sudden, when you're not being told what to do, it's like, oh, you need to tell us what to do. Like, how does this flow from a government perspective?
Yeah, well, look, it's a big challenge, and there is certainly, interestingly, Theresa May was out here recently, the former UK Prime Minister, and I had a conversation with her, and I asked her one of these questions, actually, very similar to what you've asked me, in terms of how much has this changed? How much have people become dependent on government during this period? And she has been a very staunch supporter in the UK of easing restrictions there, and her view is, her view that she presented to me was that effectively people have had enough, effectively, of that government sort of control in their life. My view is, in Australia, we probably have not, we haven't endured as hard as the UK, and I think we still probably lag a few months behind the UK in terms of their reluctance to have these sort of restrictions. So there still is a fairly strong voice in Australia that's still there saying we want some restrictions in place. But at the end of the day, those restrictions have limited benefit at this stage. We have, at the moment, 1,000 people in hospital or thereabouts in New South Wales, despite our case figures. our hospital system can cope with that, and we've invested billions of dollars in New South Wales to ensure that our hospital system can cope with that. And there, of course, there's no doubt there is stress on our healthcare workers during this pandemic, but we also need to keep life going. We need to keep kids in school. We've seen the educational attainment of our children be sacrificed during this period, and with very limited evidence behind it. And there's many health professionals out there, leading epidemiologists, who are saying that there is very limited impact in terms of COVID in children. And the reason for children being kept out of school is just not there. When we saw the Spanish flu, it was actually more effective in people with strong immune systems, the healthiest in the society, actually, because of how it replicated an overactive immune system effectively that saw those people succumb. We saw the fittest and the healthiest in our society actually succumb to the virus with the Spanish flu. What we've seen with COVID is that it's impacted a very different demographic, and they are our older and more vulnerable communities. And we need to, of course, in aged care settings and the like, and with our older communities, do everything we can to be able to protect those communities through vaccination, through any caution restrictions that might be in place, like rapid antigen tests on entering aged care facilities, like when I go see my grandmother, and undertaking those so that we protect the vulnerable. But for those where the risk is minimal, which is children in particular, we should be able to allow them to get on with their lives as much as possible. And we saw even with Omicron, the voices that were out there saying that we couldn't have kids go back to school. We saw Queensland delay the start of school. I've got an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, and I know that they are so much better in school than they are at home. And I've seen really that firsthand impact in terms of kids, their social development and their academic development during this period where it's been impacted by COVID. And I guess one of the silver linings out of it is that kids want to actually be at school now because they've seen how much they miss from it. And I've seen how my kids just run to be back at school, and how they want to be back with their teachers. They want to be back with their classmates. So we've got to do what we can with the threat that we face. Now, I'm not for one second saying that the threat will not change. Like, we do not know. None of us know what will come next. My hope, of course, is that we will see maybe more transmissible, less deadly variants be the standard. But we could see a more transmissible, more deadly variant, and we will have to change our response in reaction to that. But we've got to make sure that the threat level also dictates our response, and that's so important to see at the moment. And I think that hopefully the Australian community is becoming more and more comfortable with living alongside the virus with the threat level it poses at the moment, and I think they are.
And if that happens, mate, what gives you a level of confidence that, as New South Wales government and leading the state, that we've got this, that we can deal with this even better than what we've handled before? Because I think the New South Wales government's done a sterling job, certainly when you measure it against other governments across Australia. Yeah,
look, I think there's a funny level of parochialism. I'm sure if we're having this podcast in Queensland, there'd be a different sort of view.
Well, let me just say this, mate. I'm a Queenslander, born and bred Queenslander now. So, yeah, it pains me to say, but the New South Wales government has done a sterling job. If I was in Queensland, I would be pulling my hair out.
Okay, well, that's anyway, good to hear. That's good to hear. Usually I find myself putting my foot in my mouth when it comes to South Australians, but I noted their Premier sort of actually acknowledged yesterday that they were probably a little bit too slow to ease restrictions in South Australia in comparison to...
We've just lost all listeners from South Australia.
But it's like everybody, I think, has learnt something through this process. No state's got it 100% right. Every state's responded differently, and every state's had different factors. And look, I was a strong advocate for New South Wales having a stronger response to restrictions than South Australia at the beginning of the pandemic, because the threat was more in New South Wales and Victoria than it was in South Australia. And that was just by the virtue of us being Australia's gateway. Effectively, people coming from overseas were coming into New South Wales. The threat was bigger in Sydney than it was in regional areas or in South Australia. So we needed to have different gradients of response. What makes me confident that New South Wales has got this going forward? I think we've learnt lessons through every wave we've had. We learnt lessons through the first wave. We learnt lessons through the Northern Beaches cluster that emerged and how we confronted that. We learnt lessons through Delta, and we learnt lessons through Omicron. And we've learnt lessons from, what we didn't get right in every one of those. And I'm quite confident that if a new variant emerges, and that new variant proposes a stronger threat to New South Wales, I'm pretty confident that the decision makers in New South Wales will respond appropriately to that threat. And I think that lessons have been learnt from Omicron in terms of our preparedness. And we, from very early days, I still remember the first discussion I had when it was called the new variant, and it wasn't new variant. And I was talking to a business chamber, and I was saying to them, look, we just don't know what's around the corner. There's this new variant. And this was very much when we were at sort of the end of, we gotten to 90% odd vaccination in New South Wales. The community was fatigued from the lockdowns. Business was looking at Christmas and how they were going to open up. And I was very cautionary in having the discussion with them, saying we just don't know what this is going to present. We don't know what different responses. And I was very much the party pooper in that discussion, as everyone's like, let's get back to the city. Let's have everyone in for Christmas parties. This is going to be great. And of course, Omicron hit. We saw Christmas not cancelled by government restrictions, but Christmas cancelled for so many because they were in isolation because they had COVID or had come into or had a family member with COVID. And of course, we saw the scramble for rapid antigen tests and PCR testing over the summer as people were trying to travel. So I think it's taught us a lot of lessons in terms of how we have to change for any variant that we encounter into the future. And I think New South Wales has learnt those lessons in terms of our response, whether we have to go harder or whether we have to actually ease restrictions to deal with a more transmissible variant that may pose less of a risk, for instance. And that might be in terms of levels of isolation or close contacts, as we've already sort of navigated through. So I'm confident we've got it, but we'll see. There's twists and turns ahead, no doubt, in this response. And I remember listening to a podcast a while back, and they were saying this isn't the end of the beginning. This is the beginning of the end. So we'll see what comes before us.
Yeah, in regards to sort of business specifically and this sort of, re-emerging, reopening and stuff, and does government have any information that you're aware of where, there's an element of the business community which won't come back? It's just they haven't survived all of these issues that have happened over time. And what does that look like? Can you give us some picture? And then what's government doing? What sort of support is on the ground to bring us back into a thriving economy?
Well, look, I think that, funnily enough, actually through this period, less businesses have closed than we had anticipated. And we were starting to get a little bit worried, probably at the back of 2020, about zombie businesses, effectively, that were staying afloat because of government support, particularly with the first iteration of JobKeeper, where I think business closures were about a fifth in 2020 of what they were in 2019. Gives you an idea of sort of how many businesses that through the government lifelines were kept in operation. And I've got to say I knew a few of those myself, where good friend of mine actually had a business that really probably should have closed operation in 2020, but because of government support, he kept going into 2021. And it did eventually close. And so I think we're seeing a little bit of a legacy of some of those businesses, and there will always be businesses that will close, sadly, in the market, and that's the very nature of small business. What we need to do is be able to make sure that our economy is pretty responsive. We're seeing unemployment at 4.2%. The biggest complaint I hear from business is they just can't get staff. There are a lot of opportunities out there for people. They might not necessarily be in the industries people want to be in. And we've seen through this pandemic as well that people are yearning safety. And so if you want to take a job in the hospitality sector, you've seen that close down several times before and been the first to close down effectively. So being able to attract people to industries like that. We've got a tourism sector with borders opening that we want to thrive again, and being able to keep businesses like that were good businesses alive. And we've had lots of lifelines, creative industries as well. that have gone out to those businesses to allow them to effectively continue to operate in a dormant setting, continue to operate with staff being connected to those businesses so they could fire back up again. And that's been, I think, the key really to our response and how strong our economy has remained, that we've been able to keep that association with businesses and their employees, because without that, businesses can't really restart again when they're trying to fire up and find staff. And we're already seeing a lot of those challenges. But I think we've learned a lot of lessons through this pandemic in terms of supply chain, in terms of what we need to do to keep ourselves self-sufficient. And we're seeing more challenges when we look at the global setting as well. We see with Ukraine what's happening, and Russia's aggression, and what that could mean in the future as well. It's fairly easy for Australia to have sanctions in place with Russia where we have very limited economic engagement. But if there was to be another player in the future where Australia is much more economically tied, those sanctions would have a much bigger impact. So I think the lessons of the last few years show us that we need to be much more self-sufficient, and we need to look at our own manufacturing capacity, our own supply chain. And there's a lot of work being done in moving that way with advanced manufacturing and task forces in New South Wales. And that creates a lot of economic opportunities for the future, particularly situated around the Aerotropolis in Western Sydney, the building of that new Western City, Parkland City, the city of Bradfield, the opportunities there. So I'm pretty confident about the future, and particularly the economic opportunities here in New South Wales and more broadly in Australia, as we look at how we perhaps have become a little lazy and have been able to get cheaper resources and industries from other parts of the world, and how we need to become more self-sufficient. And there's a big economic driver there as well.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. I know we've got to be sort of careful of time and where you've got to get to, but I want to ask you about the systems of government. You know, we've got local, we've got state, we've federal. Your state, New South Wales specifically, again, through your role in the COVID response, what would you like to see change in the future around how our systems of government work? Because there's certainly been some issues that have, I guess, been highlighted through a pandemic type situation.
Well, funnily enough, actually, in many ways, I think that while there might be some issues that have emerged, it's actually shown that our system does work in a funny sense, that we can have a variation of responses in different states and different geographical regions. I guess that Australians very much have that view, in a sense that we'd like to see the government doing something, and then it comes down to which government. And the Australian public doesn't care which government, they just care that government will actually do it and that there's not buck passing. And that's one of the big challenges, I think, in this environment, that accountability can be transferred, and accountability and the squabbles that people see between federal, state and local governments. And I don't think the public buys into that. They want to just see us sort our stuff out and be able to get on with the job. But it was always funny. I've been, and goes back to my maiden speech, been a strong supporter of states' rights and the primacy of the state, so to speak, in terms of our government. And when people would often argue for one level of government would go, they would usually point to the state government and say, well, we can have a federal government. We understand why there needs to be a federal government and local government, but what's the point of state? I think this has actually shown the points of states and the importance of states, particularly as service delivery organisations. The federal government doesn't have the infrastructure or the expertise to deliver on the ground, and I think that's been shown. And that's got nothing to do with which colour's in. That's got to do with the nature of federal government and why it's there and how our constitution set it up. The states are the service delivery arms, and I think we've seen over the last 2 years how important that is, and where I think that probably Australians could now name other state premiers where they may not have been able to in the past, and they've watched them. And we've seen different responses in different states, and there are many who would say that that is a bad thing. I personally don't think it is. There are certainly times that I've had frustrations with other states that I've thought that we needed a more collegiate approach between states in our responses, and particularly when it came to things like the freight industry, for instance, and testing requirements, and where you do have a national freight task, and that interaction between states, border closures, those sort of elements of frustration. But in the end, I think that largely it actually has served Australia relatively well, and it has meant that where there are different levels of threat, we've responded in a different way rather than universally responded in the same way. And I think that's actually been a bit of an achievement during the pandemic. But it would have been nicer in a sense to the way National Cabinet started out, if that had have continued on throughout. And I know that as we speak today, there's a National Cabinet meeting, and I'll be interested to see what comes out of it. But National Cabinet started off really well, and I think it's better than COAG, but it'd be nice if it was more cooperative than what maybe we've seen at times.
I want to go back to, I guess, the homeschooling and potential hidden costs as a result of this pandemic, and whether it's related to children, mental health, whatever. What is that the biggest one that you see in your, from your previous role and your, living and breathing the roles now and your involvement around the hidden costs, the hidden pandemic that people talk about? Where do you see that as the biggest danger moving forward for our country?
Well, look, I definitely think when it comes to our kids, that's the biggest cost. The educational attainment that is able to be achieved via Zoom, let me praise teachers for the way they've been able to be nimble, adaptable and flexible in delivering the curriculum online. But there is just a difference between, and look, every parent's circumstance has been incredibly different as well. Some parents are able to sit there all day and spend their time dedicated to their children. Others have the juggle. Others are not really able to do it at all and have to leave their kids to their own devices. And that's really shown a different educational attainment, I think, during these past 2 years. And I certainly would hope that moving into the future, that closure of schools is the last resort always for every state. But I think that's the biggest impact we'll face in terms of that generation at different levels of schooling and their advancement, and that does concern me. And we need to do a lot, and we are in New South Wales in terms of tutoring and that, and being able to get kids up to scratch and really be able to pick up. And funnily enough, even with my own kids, I found there are some areas where they improved. Like I've got young kids; their reading improved somewhat because it was one-on-one in terms of the instruction they were getting, but it's not the same as being able, on Zoom or on Seesaw, or that being able to do that work remotely. And of course, the other one is the mental health, the shadow pandemic, as it's always deemed. And I chair the Parliamentary Friends of Mental Health as well. And just sort of being able to see some of those impacts in mental health, isolation, people who are already isolated and on the fringes, who find themselves more isolated because they just haven't been able to, at certain times, have that human interaction which we all yearn for, really to be able to keep our sanity, so to speak. And I think that's going to leave some significant scars into the future as well. And relationships. For some, spending months on end at home with your partner works incredibly well. For others, it doesn't. I think all of us, if we're to be relatively open and frank, have had our own challenges. I certainly have, in terms of our relationship particularly my wife and I, who we love each other very, very much, but we're used to a life where a lot of the time we don't spend together, and then finding ourselves in home together for months on end. And I think that's something that, as is often the cliche, familiarity breeds contempt, and that's happened in a lot of relationships. I think a lot of them have strengthened in this period as well. I think even though we face challenges in my own relationship, I think we've strengthened during this period as well. But that's something I know of so many breakups that have occurred from fairly long-term relationships during this pandemic as well. And I think that's something we'll have to overcome as a society too.
Here's your chance to give all us blokes some relationship advice, mate. What's that one thing you did to improve, you learn about yourself over this lockdown period and pandemic? What have you implemented to make yourself a better husband?
Oh, I think my best week was sort of as we went into the Delta wave, and my wife actually found herself in isolation. So she had half the house downstairs, which we were very fortunate to have a downstairs that's sort of lockable and, can be its own self-contained entity. And so I found that the best thing I could do during that period where she was in isolation was to make sure she had a great meal every night, and even for lunch as well, because that was pretty much what she was waiting for. It was sort of the only interaction or change she had, in a sense, in being able to have a meal delivered to the door and sort of have that element of surprise as to what it was. So that was certainly an area where I picked up some brownie points in cooking to the recipe books, which I don't usually do. And
home cooked as well, mate.
100% home cooked. 100% home cooked. There was no takeaway, but
that is lots of brownie
I went
points.
all out, and it's not my usual thing to pull out. My wife's very much the culinary queen of our house, but to be able to pull out the recipe books and to do something a little bit more creative and something I hadn't done before, and being able to present that. So that was certainly something that taught me a lesson about making sure I put that effort into to bringing a little bit of light to her day. It was a pretty dark time, but I've got to say, I think that when she emerged from her isolation, she probably sort of wanted to go back, because life had been pretty good, not having to look after the kids, having every meal prepared for you, and being able to get a fair amount of rest. So I think there was a week where she probably struggled with coming back to the real world after being in isolation. And being back to the real world of not being able to leave your house either. So,
yeah, did you develop a love of cooking? You now cook every night?
Look, I've always done my fair share of the cooking, but it probably has not been as creative before or since those 2 weeks of isolation.
That's my lovely wife's criticism of me too. Whenever I say I'm going to cook a meal, it's curry or sausages or spag or something like that. There's not too much variety in my repertoire.
Yeah, well, exactly. Mine's fairly similar. There's meat, there's vegetables. They're cooked, but they're served up on a plate, and there's no Heston Blumenthal to help me.
Mate, I also want to ask, because you're in a game in politics where humility, in my experience, can be few and far between. I've had the privilege of knowing you for a while now, and I've always found you have a good level of humility and sort of down to earth. What do you do to maintain that in the game you're in?
I think, as we talked about offline, we're all people, effectively, at the end of the day, no matter what position we hold. I am a public servant. That's my job. I'm elected to do this. There's no airs or graces that comes with that. And so for me, I don't really see it in any different way. And look, I've got to say, through this period in particular, one of the real difficulties for me in a personal perspective was really being in a position of great privilege, in having a stable job, despite the drag on my time and the difficult situations we went through. I was in a pretty privileged position in knowing that I had a job where many others around me didn't. Seeing friends and family who were losing significant amounts of pay, high levels of job security, it's all pretty humbling. And to know at the end of the day that a lot of the decisions we made were not popular, and they were difficult decisions. And as I said to my wife one day, when she was critical of a lot of the decisions we made as well, I was like, no matter what we do, there's really nothing which is the perfect answer. And you go one way, you disappoint. Like, I don't think most of the decisions we made pleased everybody. I think in hindsight, a lot of people look back and say they were the right calls and they were the right decisions, and that we've ended up in a better position than a lot of other places around the world, most places around the world, in fact. But to tell people that they've got to stay in their houses, it's not an easy thing to do. And it's not an easy thing to do yourself either. And I think, as we've seen around the world, the lessons is that people want their representatives to walk the talk as well. And if they make the decisions, they want them to abide by them as well. And I've been really conscious throughout this period that whatever we expect anyone else to do, we've got to be able to do ourselves too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, mate. To wrap this up now, I always ask my guests, what has been the greatest impact on your own leadership journey, mate?
Well, I think it's been really understanding during this time and others the importance of a lot of different voices and hearing a lot of different voices. And, I've always gone back to that Edmund Burke line of, your representative owes you their considered conscience. It's not necessarily a majority will vote, but it's that considered conscience that you've got to take on all of the inputs that are there, all of the voices, and come to your own view. And there are times when you can listen to people, and there are times when you can hear them out, but you can still disagree with them. But you've got to hear those voices. And during this period in particular, you've got to go through and you've got to go against all your own preconceptions, so to speak. And as I said before about ideology, and you've got to put it aside and you've got to question it. And you've got to question it all the time to see what is the right response. And sometimes during this, as it's a cliche, but there's no playbook. And a lot of the time you'll have a gut instinct as to what's right and what's wrong. And you might prove to be 100% wrong on that gut instinct, but sometimes you got to back it in. And I've seen a lot of, leaders who've taken that path. They've backed it in, but they've also been open to realise when they are wrong and to change course when the evidence is in front of them. And I think you've got to do that. And I think the pandemic's shown us that you can be 100% convinced that what you're doing is right, but the evidence might be before you that it isn't. And you've got to be pretty open and quick to respond and to be able to change when you need to. And that shouldn't be seen as any sort of failure, but it should be seen as actually being a good leader, in my book.
Yeah, well said, mate. And please hold those thoughts. And if you're having conversations with any colleagues, either Liberal, Labor, or any form of political persuasion, please feel free to remind them of those things as much as you can when they maybe forget. But mate, look, I want to say again,
I think
really,
just on that point, I think it goes back to, and I'll of course misquote, but it's. I think it was a Thatcher quote of, when the facts change, I change my mind. And that's what we've got to be pretty mindful of.
Absolutely, mate. Scott, I want to say a massive thank you, mate. I really do appreciate your time. Hopefully I haven't sort of put you a little bit late for the next engagement, but again, you've been very patient. Really appreciate it, mate. Thanks for coming on and sharing some of those intimate thoughts around yourself personally and where you're at and some of the values, challenge you've had, and certainly your role all compassing that up around the pandemic, mate. Really appreciate it. Appreciate the work you're doing and the government of New South Wales. I think they are serving us very, very well overall in the greater scheme of things. So, mate, keep doing it. Thanks very much for being a valued guest on the Culture of Things podcast.
Great to join you, Brendan. Thanks so much.
How self-sufficient is your business? Have you identified the risks in your business and taken steps to mitigate them? As we've all experienced in recent times, it's important for business to be self-sufficient. Consider your reliance on parts of your business where you have no or very little control. It doesn't mean you have to change things completely, but in the case of supply chains, it may mean spreading the risk, like having a couple of different suppliers in different countries. Another risk could be related to marketing. As an example, if you're reliant on Facebook ads, you have to keep paying to get your customer market. Building up your own email list allows you to contact your target market without being controlled by algorithms or the size of your budget. The pandemic has forced us all to look at our business and make changes to be more self-sufficient. The big question is, will you continue to be proactive around the need for self-sufficiency, or will you be reactive and wait for the next pandemic? These were my 3 key takeaways from my conversation with Scott. My first key takeaway: leaders focus on clarity over certainty. This is important all the time, but in times of a crisis like a pandemic, it's even more important. If leaders waited to be certain, the situation would get away from them very quickly. The same is true in business and sport. If you wait for certainty, very little gets done. And unless you have a crystal ball, you can never be certain. Leaders know certainty isn't the end game. It's having the whole team clear on what's next and moving forward together to achieve it. My second key takeaway: leaders make the tough decisions. On many occasions, leaders will be called upon to be courageous. Think about what Scott said. It was a challenge of lives and livelihoods. Each one of those impacts the other. What a decision to have to make. It's an extreme example, but a great one where leaders have to be courageous and make tough decisions. My third key takeaway: leaders seek a variety of educated opinions. This is a key factor before being able to make the tough decisions. Educated opinions mean people with credibility in the topic of conversation, not the opinions from armchair experts. The best leaders ask questions, seek input, and create the environment for people to speak up and share their educated opinion. So in summary, my three key takeaways were: leaders focus on clarity over certainty. Leaders make the tough decisions. And leaders seek a variety of educated opinions. If you want to talk culture, leadership, or teamwork, or have any questions or feedback about the episode, leave me a comment on the socials, or you can leave me a voice message at thecultureofthings.com. Thanks for joining me, and remember, the best outcome is on the other side of a genuine conversation.